Just glad everybody's here. I'm very excited here to be talking to you today about contract-driven development and how, in our experience, and we hope it will be the same for you, how it sort of brings the teams together and helps us ultimately deliver our software faster. So, quick point of introduction. I'm Chris Chandler. I'm a senior MTS, short for member of technical staff. Kind of makes it sound like I work at the help desk, but you can think of it as like a staff engineer. It's an old Bell Labs term, but I'm focused on things in the developer productivity and engineering space. So trying to bring that sort of developer advocate view as well as that sort of platform engineering style view to all of our shared common platforms and tools, amongst which Postman is one. So a quick walkthrough of what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll just talk about what is CDD, right? Some folks may be familiar with it, some may not. There isn't one canonical way of doing CDD, so that's why we'll be talking about sort of what our journey has been through the past year. My friend Sandeep Postman has been helping us through that. So it's definitely been a journey, continually evolving, and we will continue to morph it as we go. We'll talk about where Postman plays a role in that CDD workflow, and how we're using Postman to help enable that capability and to get that flywheel going. We'll also talk about what our measure of quality is. You'll hear me talk a lot about how the contract, the API spec, just to sort of spoiler alert the thing, how the quality of that API spec is pivotal when it comes to contract-driven development. And we'll talk about what we feel the measure of a good API spec is relative to contract-driven development, and sort of how we score it, how we lead folks to what good looks like. We'll also talk about how we use that API spec to generate our contract tests, right? As we all know, very few people like writing tests. It's not the most fun thing in the world. The more that we can automate that process, and one, it ensures it gets done, and two, also gives us the opportunity to ensure that it stays in alignment as the API goes through versions. We'll talk about collaboration strategies, how once you've created that spec and the contract test and some other things that we'll talk about in the Postman universe, how we rally teams around all that stuff to help gain alignment and speed our delivery. And finally, I'll just give some ad hoc lessons learned, like some things that may not be intuitive or some things that you really want to watch out for when you're choosing to implement CDD at your organization. And then, time depending, we got a couple of mics here in the center for Q&A if we have time. So how many motorsports fans do we have here? All right, a few. If you took the plunge like me and actually went and started to learn how to drive, I used to race go-karts, and you take any instruction, one of the first things they'll tell you is that the fastest way around a lap is not barreling into that corner, right? You want to maximize the ultimate lap time. It's not about drive fast in the corner, just plow it in and turn it hard, right? You want to actually, not slow, but you go slower into the corner to maximize the exit, so that way you ultimately end up with the fastest lap going around, right? And so there's a lot of analogies to that when we start talking about contract-driven development, right? A lot of us just love to say, okay, cool, we got this new API or this new project, I'm just going to go barrel through, and I'll slap out a spec, but man, I'm going to go start writing code, right? And we just blow right through the corner like our friend Sebastian Vettel is doing right here. So what we proffer in CDD land is that you really want to have that slow in, fast out philosophy, where slow in this case, means getting really precise and detailed with the API spec itself. And we'll talk about sort of what that detail looks like. I'll walk through an example to sort of help illustrate it. But the idea is if you get to that low level of detail, it removes ambiguity. It creates alignment. And that's what our fast out is, right? So I'm not getting tapped on the shoulder to say, hey, can we have a meeting about your spec? Because I don't really understand. You say order status, but you just say it's a string. What am I supposed to do with that? I probably can't send you any string, right? There's probably a finite list. Maybe that should be an enum, right? So getting to that level of detail in your specs versus just the sort of, it compiles, like it's technically a valid spec and it lints. CDD, we sort of raise the bar for what a good spec looks like. And so by doing this, it allows us to, and by doing it regularly, by the way, allows us to avoid tech debt, right? So we don't We don't say, okay, well, you know what, this first iteration, we'll come back, we'll fix it, we'll put those details in later, because you know what, you're never going to come back and put them in later. So be honest with yourself, and as you iterate and as you create new features, work hard to keep these things in alignment. And by the way, that contract test that we'll talk about later is going to help you do that. So just put pause on this real quick and talk about what is CDD, contract-driven development. The contract in this context is that API spec, right? We all know open API specs, been around forever. Nothing's new there. What's different is that we really want to make that a contract between the provider and the consumer, right? Not just like, here's some sort of half-hearted documentation around how my API works. You sort of fiddle around and figure out the rest in an integration environment. Let's be really detailed about it. If I go and I rent an apartment, I'm going to pay the landlord this much money. They're going to fix my garbage disposal when it breaks, right? That's not on me. But if I light the carpet on fire, they're going to keep my security deposit, right? The rules of the road are very clearly spelled out. And so think of it almost like a legal contract. And so we want to rally around that contract, right? Make sure that we gain that alignment by making sure that everybody's on the same page and that, that anywhere that we have the reasonable chance to remove ambiguity and doubt, let's just do it, right? It takes literally, 2-3 minutes on a per field or property basis to go look at your code, understand, the limits around that field and property, put that in the spec, and make sure that, there's not that opportunity to go step on rakes later when you try to integrate the provider and the consumer. And then finally, CDD, you probably are thinking things like TDD and BDD and all that sort of fun stuff, right? So very similar, very analogous, but just like with those other frameworks, this is not a panacea, right? This is not meant to be a replacement for flow testing, functional testing, end-to-end testing, any of that sort of stuff. It is intentionally happy path, and you can think of it almost as like unit tests for your API, right? I'm going to hit that API, I'm going to exercise it, and then I'm going to deeply, as we'll show later, deeply inspect the response that I get back from that API to make sure that you're holding up your end of the contract as the API provider. So you can think of CDD as a life cycle analogous to SDLC or any of the other lovely life cycles that we'd like to talk about in software development. It all starts at the top with that design, right? So that's our API spec, that's our touchstone, that is again our contract, right? That is what we are all going to rally around. And so from there, once we have that spec, we can simulate it via mocks. The folks in purple who are my consumers can provide me early feedback. We obviously code and deploy those things, right? That's being done today. But what was new for us was adding in the validation part, the contract test that we'll talk about here in a minute. Using that contract test to then continuously monitor the API, right? Sometimes I may ship a breaking change through my code. Sometimes something upstream of me may change something such that I'm no longer in alignment with the spec because I didn't have defensive code to guard against that. It could be a change in the environment. Somebody might have kube-cuddled in and changed the config map. Nobody does that, right? So all these things, it's just there as a backstop to keep you honest, right? And then obviously, my consumers can go request features, which feeds back into the design, and we start that virtuous cycle all over again. So where does Postman hook into that cycle? Well, at that very top, of course, it becomes the place that we put all of our API specs. And the important thing is when we put our API specs in there, that we provide the governance rules that make those API specs what we call good, right? So in our case, we put in close to 60 custom API governance rules that define what we think good looks like. And I'll kind of show you a more visual representation of that here in a little bit. But the idea is that by having those specs out there in both team workspaces and API network, we can again rally around, discover those things, and gain alignment. And more importantly, be able to, as we'll talk about here in a second, the open collaboration part, be able to provide real-time, inline feedback within those specs to again have those discussions, right? It's not something somebody talks about at the water cooler. It's right there out in the open. Everybody comes to see it. The other part is I keep talking about these contract tests. Well, those just come in the form of a collection, right? It's a collection like any other Postman collection, with one key difference. In the post request scripts that we'll show an example of here in a little bit, we're going to deeply validate the schema that came from that API spec. So you'll hear me say quite a few times that it's a quality in, quality out scenario. If your spec is real loosey-goosey, well, you might as well just assert true, right? That's the reason for the specificity, is to keep ourselves honest about when we send that payload back, does it actually meet the letter of the law, what we said we were going to send? And then again, for that collaboration aspect, it's not just communicating that I've got versions going through the environments and here's the Postman assets, API specs and collections and things of that nature that align to that version of that API in that environment. But again, having a lot of those real-time and asynchronous feedback loops, right? As a consumer, I can fork a collection and provide feedback on it and submit pull requests and things of that nature. So Postman is central to everything that we do in CDD. So I'll talk about what our measure of quality is. I think it's probably a pretty universal one, but again, the intent here is not to say this is quote unquote the way to do CDD, right? I'm just trying to give you insight into the decisions we made and the frameworks that we use so you can bring that back and apply it to what makes sense for your organization. But for us, it was all around contract clarity. So we have, for better or for worse, quite a few pre-production environments, and we treat those like production. We have, like a full ITIL stack around it, change and incident and problem management, right? So we know when things aren't going well in those non-prod environments, why we're running into issues. And far and away, integration issues were the number one thing, right? Provider says, hey, here's my API, consumer comes to use it, they put those two things together, mushroom cloud, right? Things don't work. And then at that point, everybody gets pulled into a triage bridge, because again, we run it like prod. And now a developer, instead of shipping that new feature, is now over here on a triage bridge, trying to answer a question that honestly could have been answered if that spec were of a sufficient level of clarity. So for us, contract clarity was far and away the number one thing. Again, you heard me mention earlier, we have, like I said, almost 60 Spectral API governance rules that we've created to guide teams towards what good looks like. So I'll show you here a view that we have, but we also, in addition to what's in Postman, because those things all show up as error warning info, but not all error level violations are the same, right? Some are more important than others. So we built a pipeline that goes and pulls every API spec, evaluates it against those same rules, and kicks out a score. And as you can see here, the points across these, contract clarity is the top, but I'll sort of walk through some of the other ones just to give you an idea of what those are about. But we'll double click into contract clarity here in a second. So things like data model integrity is making sure that, that across the spec, that your data models make sense, right? You don't say customer here, but customers there, or you don't, have, let's say phone number is a 10-character string here, but then like a 1 plus, E9, 961 or 161 format, there, right? So it actually looks across the whole spec to make sure that those things are consistent. So so I'm not confused as a consumer. Why did 10 characters for a phone work here, but then I need +1 over here, right? Security, kind of a gimme, but are you telling me what sort of authentication you support? Documentation, do I know how to reach out to your team as a consumer? How do I find the people that own this API spec? Is there reference documentation outside of Postman for it? Things of that nature. Global consistency, that's where we're looking to see, do you use /customer here, but then /customers in a different endpoint? Do you use snake case here and camel case there? How consistent are your endpoints and whatnot across your spec? But again, for us, the key one is contract clarity, and we'll sort of dive into that here in a sec. But visually, this is how we represent it out to teams, is either on an aggregate basis. So if I'm a leader, I can choose, we have a newer version of this where I can look as a VP or a director or whatever, look at my assets, the APIs that belong to my portfolio. And I can look at how I'm trending across time with these things, right? You'll see a lot of these are pretty flatlined because, again, things like global consistency and security and stuff are kind of gimmies. But that contract clarity is where we see a lot of variation. That's where we see the room for improvement. And so this gives teams the ability to see sort of how they're doing and where they could be better. A key call out here is that the goal is not for all of this to add up to 100. Very much like unit testing, that going from 20 to 40 is great, 40 to 80 is great, 90 to 95, juice may not be worth the squeeze, right? Another key thing is that it may not make sense to go do this for all your APIs. If I've got an API that's mature, not under feature development, and not taking on new consumers, well, maybe I kind of don't care about some of this stuff for that, right? Because again, the intent is to help address those communication issues, to help, when we go to integrate these things. If there's no new integrations and no new features to be integrated with, it's probably not worth the time. So when I talk about contract clarity, let's dig into an example of that. So walk up to anybody on the street and say, what format do you think a zip code is? And they say, oh yeah, it's a bunch of numbers. That's an integer. Well, probably not, right? Because what happens if you live up in the Northeast? What does your zip code start with? And what do computers do with integers with leading zeros? Chucks it right out. So, that can manifest itself in really interesting ways, hypothetically speaking. So, okay, fine. So it's not a zip code, it's a string. Cool. Okay, I got to write this API. Let's go. Well, cool. So I can lorem ipsum into that zip code for my test data, or is that not going to work? Yeah, you're probably going to reject that too, right? Hopefully you're type safe and and then you're looking, you're doing data validation before you go try to chuck something in a DB, right? So okay, fine. So we know string's not going to work. Okay, fine. It's 5 digits in a string. Okay, can we write the API now? Well, no, we can't, because sometimes I'm going to have that dash and the 4 characters after that, right? So, we started off with the wrong damn data type to begin with, and then where we arrive at good is I've got my type, I've got a max length, I've got a min length, I've got a regex, and when it comes to automating test case generation, I've got an example, right? That's good for the humans. It's also good for all these automation tools that will take that example and make that, it's sort of bring your own test data in a way, right? So think about it that way. So not only does it provide clarity for the, for the carbon-based life forms that are implementing against this API, but it's also going to, help steer the computers in the right way too. So now this is what we're looking for when we say, a high quality, a high level of contract clarity, right? So once we've got that high level of contract clarity, that now allows us to have, again, that quality in, quality out scenario where, because I've invested that time to deeply say this is exactly what zip code looks like, and boy, it sounds silly when you say I'm going to sit here and have a debate over what zip code looks like, but look at what we just went through, right? So imagine other things. Again, I'll go to order status or customer state or some other more nebulous term, where you need to be using enums or or just being much more strict about how you define what that data is going to look like. So there are tools that can automate creation of those contract tests, right? It's going to look at that API spec. It's going to go, same way with the auto-generated. In fact, it is using the auto-generated collection that you get from an API spec. But then in this case, we're using a tool called Portman. Postman's got their own contract generator collection that works similarly, but we went for more of a command line approach. And so Portman gives you that, where you can point it at an API spec and tell it what you want the collection to be. But it will go, again, very happy path. It's not meant to be a negative test case or fuzzing or any of that sort of fun stuff. But it's going to give you a collection that hits every operation on every path, uses that schema that you gave it, and is going to create tests in the post request scripts to go do that deep level of validation. So let's talk about what that looks like. So imagine I have this endpoint that, I give it a latitude and longitude, and it's going to kick me back to zip code or something like that. So what you see here, all of this was written by that tool. Not a single line of this was written by a human. So The idea is it's going to go look at for each and every endpoint and operation you can do on that endpoint. It's going to use the API spec. And it's going to say, oh, okay, cool. You told me that you're going to ship me JSON. So I'm going to see, is there a content type header? Is it set to application JSON? Okay, cool. First test done. Okay, now let's see if I could take the payload you sent me. Can I go marshal that into a JSON object? Okay, cool. I'm doing that via the PM response to have JSON body there. So now you'll see this constant here. This is where the payoff comes in. That schema constant there came from the API spec itself. So hopefully this helps illustrate the quality in, quality out, right? If I went back and I said type string, okay, great. I know it's not an integer, but have I really moved the needle when it comes to preventing those integration issues? So, here, it's bringing all that stuff across, max length, min length, pattern, all that fun stuff that we had. And then finally, at the bottom here, it's going to say, okay, I'm expecting that response to align to this JSON schema, right? Very simplistic example. I mean, you can get into much more complex schemas, but the pattern applies across the board, right? That the better you define that schema in your API spec, the better validation you're going to get on the back end, when it's going and auto-generating these tests. Certainly write them by hand, but in our case, we're trying to automate as much of that as possible. When there's a commit, when the API spec changes, can we auto-generate the contract tests so then there is no chance for misalignment? So another key thing that we use Postman for in the CDD world is to communicate changes. So again, like I mentioned earlier, if you have an API that's mature, it's not under any development, that you're not taking on any new consumers, payoff's not there, right? So really we're focusing the efforts for CDD on things that are under relatively rapid iteration. And so one key thing for us is that at T-Mobile, we are really clean about making sure that we use our asset management system when we create new things. So I'm going to create a new API, a new microservice, whatever it may be. We create an asset for that at the beginning. When you create the associated code repo, those two things get linked. And we have functions in the CI/CD pipelines that can go grab that stuff in real time, right? So, so as an example, if I have the asset ID of the API that's being deployed, and I've got a naming convention where that asset ID exists, and I know what environment I'm deploying to, and I can map all that stuff up, after the deployment, I can automatically go run that contract test. And so as the provider of that API, I know almost the second that I ship a contract breaking bug, right? Because otherwise what happens, especially if it's some endpoint that not too many people call, you only find out about it when somebody steps on that rake in an integration test, right? So the whole idea is, can we, everybody's favorite phrase, shift left, but can we shift that awareness left to know that as soon, when I'm still have the cognitive, or when still in my input buffer as a developer, that what is the thing I just worked on and I just broke something? That's better than trying to go back 3, 4 weeks, a month later and trying to figure out, oh crap, what was it that I did that broke that? And I got to go back and look at the commit and get my mind back into that mode. So for us, those naming conventions are key, right? So you see it here on the right side. You see, a friendly service name. That DU stands for deployable unit. That's just the thing that can be atomically shipped, an API, API proxy, a database, whatever. And then for the different, and you'll notice the version numbers we put in the names as well. It may seem a little redundant, right? Because APIs have versioning and all that sort of fun stuff. But I got to go click into that API object to see what the version is. Here, it's just out in the open. And selfishly for me as the person running the program, I also can just go pull the names of all the things and know what aligns with a particular, asset, right? But also for the humans involved, you see we're sort of connecting the dots, right? We're holding that same sort of name across the board, right? So we've got the spec, the collection, the environment, all that stuff, the names and the versions all line up, right? And through things like environment pinning, we can guide our consumers to what version lives where. And as somebody who is running this particular API, it makes it easy for me to then go search and find when I upgrade versions. So here, I just upgraded prod to 1.2. version 1.1's not around anymore. It's easy for me to find those assets and keep my house clean so people aren't implementing against a version of the API that doesn't exist anymore. So for us, for all those reasons, that naming convention and putting the version numbers in the assets themselves, has been a big payoff for us. And again, it's really all about lowering the cognitive load for the folks that are trying to understand how to draw that through line across all those assets and know, okay, this is the API spec for the environment against which I'm trying to integrate. So I'll wrap up with a few words of wisdom. Again, I mentioned it earlier, strike a balance, right? Don't go for 100% on that API, on what you think good looks like in an API. Don't do CDD when you're not iterating or making any changes to that API spec, right? It's just the payoff's not there. So, focus on the right places, but, the old saying, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, right? All of that applies here. Metrics are key. Like anything, anytime that you implement a program like this, or a new pattern or try to change the culture around how we build and ship APIs, you kind of go into it with a theory and a hypothesis. Recall what I said about our non-prod environments. We treat them like prod. We have incidents, we have problem management. Like we know what's going on in those environments and what's ultimately keeping us from shipping faster. So for us in CDD land, we're focused on integration bugs, right, or incidents where we're looking, and so we should see as CDD adoption kicks up, we should see a similar downtick in the number of integration issues. I should also be able to see that feature velocity is getting quicker, right? So go into it knowing what those measures are going to be, and also, again, be willing to not try to be perfect and get every stat or whatever. Start with a few, see where it leads you, you'll find more. And then finally, as Padme warns us here, be really clean with your secrets. This is one of the things as we get into that more collaborative mode, really important that, we're not putting secrets in initial values in environments, right? We're not hard-coding stuff in collections. It's a really easy mistake to make. So just make sure that, every chance that you have, you drill that home with your teams and that you've got alignment there. So with that, I'll thank everybody for coming. And if you have questions, there's a couple of mics here in the center.
Hello. I have it's not really a quick question, but I'll ignore the human cultural side of it. As you sort of begin your journey of contract clarity, right? Because I work at a place where the sky is falling and non-technical stakeholders are like, hey, but can we ship it? Why is planning taking so long? Mm-hmm. If contract clarity isn't there and we're not in a culture of like questioning or pushing back on requirements, maybe mobile team gives requirements to a cloud team and they go, sure, sounds good. And then halfway through integration, we go, oh, this isn't actually working. What does that journey towards contract clarity look like? Like, how do you kind of assess the field and go, okay, where are our problems? Where do we start?
Well, I think it's sort of analogous back to what I mentioned is for us, we have some of those measures, right? I forget where I heard this, but somebody earlier in my career said, people can bring their opinions, I'll bring data, right? People can always argue about, whether this is more important or that's more important or this has a higher priority or that has lower priority. Sometimes, yeah, somebody with a higher pay grade makes that decision for you. But my experience with CDD or otherwise, when you're trying to push a big initiative like this, is to come with that data, right? That's where for us, being able to speak to, here is the person hours spent, going and being stuck on a triage bridge for something that wasn't their fault because, they didn't have an easy way of saying, look, my stuff is in alignment, it's good, I didn't change anything, can I get out of here, right? So being able to come with those numbers and those facts is what I've found to be the best way to sell it. But sometimes at the end of the day, yeah, it just depends on the culture of your company. Sometimes it's just that the right person with the big enough paycheck makes that call. So wish I had some secret sauce for you, but that's, in my sadly 25 years experience in enterprise, that's been what I've found to be the most compelling. Bring data.
follow up real quick. What data points do you use to sort of bring to the table?
As far as the outcomes, as far as how to drive the behavior, which?
How to drive the behavior.
Yeah, it's mainly that score guy that I showed you earlier, right? So it's really about giving them the data to know, we give the rules of the road of, we have tons of documentation around what good looks like. We all know how that goes. Nobody reads it, right? But it was important for us to actually start there. Like I wrote a really boring policy doc that defined what good looked like, but then that became the grist for the mill that turned into those 55 plus governance rules, right? And so then you can take that and sort of up-level it, make it easier. But then at the end of the day, if there's not something like this that doesn't give them a heartbeat of, where are you now? And then over time, where are you trending? Then, yeah, it's sort of a problem that's sort of often a force and nobody hears it, right? So for me, it's not about creating walls of shame or beating people up over it. It's really just about awareness, right? Imagine if you didn't have a check engine light or a engine temperature thing on your dash, right? Your engine could blow up, and it's like, well, heck, if I'd have known, I would have pulled the car over. But so really, it's just about awareness, and then the other part that I've found useful in these types of journeys, lean into. You're going to find somebody who gets it. Lean into those folks, make them successful, and let them sell it. Right? When you're the guy who runs the guy or gal who runs the process, and you come and tell you, oh man, CDD is going to save your life. They'll look at you, okay, yeah, fine, whatever. When you get some of their peers to come in and go, oh yeah, man, we came in and we rolled our eyes too, but we rolled up our sleeves, we did the work. It kind of sucked, but like the outcomes made it suck less, right? And so it's one of those things where you have to kind of put the adult pants on and say, okay, this is an extra rigor and discipline that will pay off. And the more you can have somebody internally championing it for you instead of you being the person trying to sell it, that's far and away, when I've tried to drive programs like this, far and away what's been most successful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and kind of going off of what you were talking about with that API spec quality matrix, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding or if you did bring it up, but I just wanted a little more clarity as to so when you are actually going through and grading these contracts, does that grading begin right when the contract has first been generated, and then you're grading it needs to reach a certain grade before it can go, or what does that life cycle look like when it comes to actually scoring these contracts?
Yeah, so for now, we're not gating on this today. So the idea is, as soon as a contract shows up, well, I should say, daily we have a pipeline that pulls all the API specs, runs it against our analysis, right? So this is more than just the linter that you get in the Postman API view, but this is again what our version of good looks like. These scores get generated daily, right? Which is kind of why you see the trends over time. So as far as when does it start getting scored, it's the second that they put that spec into Postman and the next time that our pipeline runs. We will eventually get to a point where once we have a critical level of adoption and a certain amount of success, that this will become the standard, right? So going back to that asset management stuff, when I'm running in the pipeline, again, I've got the context because that linkage this is an API that was created 3 months ago. Okay, so now this one is subject to the new level of what good looks like. And so over time, you can sort of stair step that quality bar, right? Because if you try to run a program like this, you say, everybody's got to be at 40 out of 50 contract clarity, or we're blocking everything to prod. Well, the torches and pitchforks come out, right? You're not going to be able to ship anything. So you have to be reasonable about how you sort of boil the frog and turn the temperature up over time. So does that help?
No, that does. Thank you very much.
Love the insights. Feel like you're preaching to the choir for me. Was T-Mobile always operating at this level of maturity? And if not, what were those early discussions of getting this initiative off the ground? You've mentioned some of the KPIs, but what were those conversations actually like to get these investments and the senior leadership alignment on slowing things down? Like you said, slow in, fast out.
Yep. So I would say for the API landscape in general, and actually a former T-Mobile coworker, mine, Karthik's here. He was a part of the team that helped lead this. But we have an API Center for Enablement, and so they are laser focused on the API ecosystem in that space. And so I partner with them, so that we're all aligned around what good looks like and what proper API development looks like. So I would say, there's some areas where we've been really mature, right? We've for a very long time been using open API specs and have them in the central repository, and we've done the rallying around the spec part. What we hadn't done is rallying around a high quality spec, and so really it's just we've had that culture, gosh, since 2014 or whatever, right? So, we went through the same monolith microservices journey everybody else did, right? And so luckily we saw ahead of that and realized that having those specs for communication and collaboration was super key if we wanted teams to be able to function independently. But we have admittedly been sort of suffering through some of what you're seeing here, right? Where because of that low specificity in the spec, you end up with these integration issues. So in this case, I kind of got lucky in the fact that I had leadership that for certain programs that were under rapid development, integration issues were like far and away the number one problem. So it goes back to what I said earlier about when you try to change the culture with a program like this, you kind of come into it with a theory, with a hypothesis, and so therefore with the solution that you want to measure, right? So, I'd love to say that I did some sort of Jedi mind trick and convince leadership to do it, but really it was leadership coming to me and saying, look, we're ready for a change. How can we do it? And so that's when I surveyed the landscape, and we already had Postman and got the program off the ground. So does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, I have a series of 3 questions.
Okay.
I'll try and make them real quick. So the first one is, a lot of the organizations I've worked with, you're building the back end, but your first client is normally your front end. Is this pattern something that you recommend they start off with, where you're doing like contract, following this pattern?
My personal take is yes, you want to do that as early on as possible because, as I mentioned earlier, when you say I'll go back and I'll get up to that level of clarity, I think realistically we never do, right? We always get pushed for new features and whatnot, and so if you don't do the block and tackle early on, you can't always get back to it, right? So just depends on the culture of your organization and whether people kind of hold themselves to those standards, or if maybe feature delivery will end up taking precedent over preventative stuff. Not an uncommon story, especially in large enterprises. So.
Okay. And then my second question is, what tool did you use to
to generate this? It's just a Python script. So what I did is, to be brutally honest, took all of those spectral rules, threw them at ChatGPT, threw them at Copilot, and had Copilot craft the beginnings of a Python script that goes and looks at those things. Now, I did go iterate on it and tweak on it. I found some interesting patterns where we had teams who in their API spec had content type of */*. I don't know what the hell that means. Like, are you going to send me JSON this time and a video the next and SOAP the next? Like, I don't know how that what they would even mean by doing that. But so there's some extra rules for things like that. That we sort of iterated and brought back into the spectral rules as well. But yeah, it's really just a Python script that runs as part of an Azure Data Factory pipeline that populates this data.
Okay, pretty cool. And then my final question is, if I wanted to implement this at some of my customers, do you have like a blog or any documentation that we can look at? You said you had this huge, big document that you started off writing. Would you be willing to share some of that knowledge with us so that we can start to try implement this at organizations we're working at?
Yeah, I can, I talk to some of my folks, some of my friends here at Postman. Maybe it's something we could publish together. I don't know if that, get some head nods. So, yeah, we could condense the lessons learned. Because again, really at the end of the day, just like with BDD and TDD, right? There is no like one. There's a framework and a set of rules and guidelines, but there's never like any one canonical do exactly this step, this step, this step. But yeah, happy to share any of those lessons learned and the general framework and decision points around why we decided what we did. Yeah, happy to share that for sure.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. My question is like something I face at my company right now is when we write these contracts for APIs, you have in Swagger, you have your request, you have your response, pretty detailed, and we get an API at the end, and it doesn't exactly do what we need it to do, even though the response looks correct, the format's correct, all the objects are there, but some of the semantic details about an API and like what it's supposed to do aren't captured in like the current formats and cloud format or API formats. And I'm wondering how would we go about capturing some of those like semantic rules of like, hey, this API needs to fetch all patient data and do something with it and send it back in this response format.
Yeah, so I think what I hear you say, and keep me honest, is you're asking for more of sort of maybe more of a functional test thing, right? You know, under these conditions in this scenario, the API should behave this way, but like those nuances aren't in the API spec is kind of what I hear you say. Yeah, and I don't. It's kind of where I was going at the beginning with it not being replacing functional flow and all that sort of stuff, right? Because in the spec you can only declare so many things. So what probably is a better fit there is, you know, either collections themselves, right? I'm going to illustrate this particular flow. If I'll just make it relevant to my world rather than come up with a fictitious example. But you know, like we have, if you're a T-Mobile customer and you're eligible for an upgrade, you're going to get presented a set of options that wouldn't be available if you just upgraded your phone, for example. So exact same call from an input payload standpoint would result in different payload responses based off of, you know, what sort of offers are available to that person, right? So, yeah, in that case, you know, CDD is not going to solve that problem. It is, you know, very intentionally happy path. It's really just sort of about looking at that, the shape and the format of the response itself versus the schema stated in the API spec and looking for alignment there. So collections is one place, and then I forget the exact name of the Arezzo format. Is that right? The API flow spec that OpenBear's got, that or Open API spec form or whoever owns that. Anyway, it's a similar YAML-based spec that is used to talk about flows and, you know, when this happens, this this is the expected result and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I don't think CDD is necessarily a good fit for that, but those are a couple of options I could think of that might help address that.
Well, thank you.
Yep. See, we got 2 minutes left. I don't know. Do I need to? Yeah. Okay. So I think we're gonna cut it here. But if anybody has any other questions, I'll be out in the hall. So feel free to walk up and ask. But thanks for your time. I appreciate all the great questions and all the engagement. Have a great PostCon.